Thank you for coming. I do appreciate it. I know it's the last session of the day, so yeah. So as you know, my presentation, Maximizing Agile Benefits Through Understanding Learning Styles. My name is Robin. I have a microphone on me right now. I'm a consultant at Coveros. We do a lot of DevOps and Agile transformations. I have experience with both government and commercial clients. I've worked on a variety of projects. I do have some experience in technology education, mostly with small children. I have experience with literacy education with small children. I have interests that are not just computers. And when you fill out the presentation evaluation, please do that either on your app or on these little slips at the end of the presentation. Tell them that I don't need this picture of myself on there. You can see me, it's on you, you don't need that. Okay, so the first thing I want to start with is, how is this going to benefit Agile? And this is a little less necessary since you guys have been in all the other sessions, and I think this point's been made in a lot of them, but one of the principles in the Agile Manifesto is that we value people and interactions over process. So you have a lot of different roles working together, and you have that constant feedback cycle. So I am going to ask really quick from the audience. So who here is a product owner? Can I get raise hands? Okay. Scrum Master, similar role? Okay. What about technicals? Developer, DevOps, tester? Okay. And whose role is not clearly defined in any of those, more cross-functional? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so a lot of the tips that I see for Agile are about process, though. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, it's great to time box meetings to encourage people to come to a conclusion or to come back later if there's not a conclusion. We talk about those processes for getting results and feedback, and that's great. But I also think there's a gap in that, so that's what we are talking about today. So I'm going to go through a really high-level agenda. I do have another couple slides after this. This is just the overview. So we're going to look at a preference-based model of learning styles. And then we're going to look at a cognition-based model of learning styles. And then I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about that 2008 research paper, because I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't bring it up. Someone's going to bring it up if it's not me. So we'll talk about how that fits in here and why it was not the end of science. Then we're going to get into actually mapping that into the Agile ceremonies and the Agile processes. We're going to talk about which information presentation styles might be optimal for the different ceremonies. And we're going to talk about ways to vary those strategies based on team needs and backgrounds. So remember, we're not in classrooms, we're in the workspace. We're expected to produce things. We're not passing standardized tests here. So I'm not a neuroscientist. This presentation is not a scientific endeavor, it's a practical application. So it's anecdotal, it's an overview, and it's designed to do exactly what it says, which is maximize Agile benefits through understanding learning styles. So we're going to talk about what they are, what they're not, where they fit into the Agile processes, but most of all, just highlighting this topic at all and going through these various models causes people to be more mindful about the way that they communicate. So before we really get into it, we're also going to go through some takeaways that I want you to get out of this. So it's kind of what I just said. You know, we're going to talk about why understanding these different learning styles, these different communication techniques and cognitive dimensions is actually going to promote sustainable development in your organization. We're going to going to ask you to think about which learning styles you prefer versus which of the cognitive dimensions are currently your strongest. We're going to discuss strategies to change your style of information delivery to fit the situation and the people that are there. And just the bottom line is that this knowledge and these tools have the potential to positively impact dealing with tough customers and your project's experiences in general. So I do kind of want you to be thinking about that in the back of your mind while we're going through that. And the next slide is why I care, why I picked this topic. So in addition to that, seeing that gap in the Agile principle where we talk about processes instead of people, it's also because I have a personal experience with this. So my first full-time job, I was pretty much the DevOps and automation guy. I was on a small team in a large company. And my boss didn't know much about learning styles or teaching, and I knew a lot less at the time. And at some point, we needed to take our web application into the larger company infrastructure. And so everybody was discussing this whole architectural model, and I was just not getting it. This is my first kind of exposure to that level of architecture complexity. And so I wasn't getting it, and I was feeling really stupid. And eventually my boss went and whiteboarded it for me. I don't remember how long it took for us to get to that point. It felt like much longer than it was. But he drew it on the whiteboard, and I was like, oh, okay, well, that's not complicated. But that's what it took for me to get that. And now I understand architectural patterns a lot better because we went through that. And every time we talked about a new one, he'd draw it, or he'd explain it, and then I'd draw it. So now I can talk about them verbally. I still find the diagrams helpful if it's something new, and I also understand that people who are new to architecture patterns or aren't familiar with them can benefit from a pattern, can benefit from that diagram. So that is leveraging learning and teaching styles to promote sustainable development. So we are going to talk about the term learning styles, but I do want you to be aware that it is popularly used to mean learning preferences. And just like you might prefer to eat dessert over eating vegetables, just because you prefer something doesn't necessarily mean it's better for you, but it's still going to get your attention more quickly. If I have a plate of dessert and a plate of vegetables, which one are you going to go for? So your preferred way of learning might not match up to your optimal brain cognition, but it might or might not match up with the optimal presentation for the content. So I would say in the story that I just shared, visual is a pretty good way to represent architecture. And that matched up with the way that I wanted to see it. But varying those methods of information presentation where I started to be able to talk about it after just seeing it, that's helping me improve retention. So right before we get into the models of learning styles, I do want to define what a learning style is. So as I said, classically, it's been used as a synonym for learning preferences, and that term has evolved. Learning style really means it's just behaviors around learning and memory. So there are models that group common ways of learning, common behaviors. And I also want to highlight that learning styles are not fixed. There's a concept in cognition called neuroplasticity, and that's just the concept that your brain is going to change with time and experience. So when we use our brain differently in different scenarios, and repeating skills, repeating experiences, repeating training, trains and grows those neural pathways in your brain. So it is actually changing the structure of your brain. That does help us communicate with agility, because when you're strengthening those connections, you're using more parts of your brain, and that helps you draw that information back out. And of course, when we teach or communicate, we're also learning because we're working on our mental maps and our mental schema and our mental mastery of that information. And that brings me to the last bullet point, which is that it is both possible and advisable to develop learning styles. I was just talking about neuroplasticity. You want to develop different learning styles because it engages more parts of your brain. That helps you communicate out better. So there are several different models of learning styles out there. Like all good science theories, they're constantly being iterated upon. The brain is complicated. We don't yet fully understand how it functions. So I'm going to focus on two model breakdowns. And the first is pretty popular. It is based off of Howard Gardner's theory of 7 multiple intelligences. And the reason that I'm including it is because I think it brings awareness to how different activities tickle different areas of your brain. It also shows how much overlap there is. And it's also, you'll see it in a few minutes, the one that you're probably already most familiar with. And it is more of a preference-based one. It doesn't map cleanly. I think it's important to identify your preferences because it also helps to identify your biases. So the second model that we're going to get into is the Felder-Silverman model. And it was developed specifically in the context of teaching engineering to students. So it identifies 4 dimensions of cognitive processing and has a little bit more predictive validity about students' actual default engagement with learning activities. And I'm including it because it's engineering focused and it does map teaching modalities to cognitive dimensions. So the first model of the multiple intelligences, that's useful because there are clear strategies for how we can use it to learn or teach information, and it provides ideas for which types of information might be best presented in those ways. And that gives us a context to use that next cognitive processing model so that we can develop things that are broadly accessible. And having that awareness is going to help make it easier for us to scaffold people along in their learning journeys, to give them just enough help to push them forward. So this is, and again, show of hands here. Who is familiar with this this diagram here? Is this? Okay, great. So this graphic does use slightly different names than Gardner's original names, but it's the same base model. So obviously further research has been done since 1991, but as I said, this has made its way pretty well into the hive mind. I think it's important to address. So we are going to separate the styles out for examination in just a second, but I do want to point out again, there's a lot of overlap in how people actually use these styles, especially in different scenarios. It's useful as a tool for self-reflection. It's good to look at how we can break them down and where they overlap. So in the center of this diagram here, there's two mimetic styles, which is styles of cultural information transfer. They're usually people have a stronger preference here, and that's used in conjunction with the styles around the outside. So the first one on the top here, or bottom, excuse me, is just the solitary interpersonal learning. So these are people who are private, introspective, independent while they're doing tasks. They concentrate well. They're aware of how their personal value system maps to what they're learning about. Spend a lot of time on self-analysis. And the caveat to that is they might spend too much time alone working on a problem that could be solved more quickly just by looping in somebody else. So this is an independent researcher kind of person. And you can work on developing this style in yourself. The easiest way that I would suggest is just to work on developing a meditation practice. Just slowing down to focus your thoughts and breath, even just for a few minutes a day, can put you a lot more in tune with yourself and help you gain control over your thoughts and to balance out your brain. So the other style of cultural information transfer is social or interpersonal learning. So people who have a strong preference in this area might enjoy mentoring or counseling others. People come to them with advice because they're good listeners. These are the kind of people who bounce thoughts or ideas off of others to see how they respond. Prefer to work through issues in a group and learn well from other people. So one-on-one with an instructor or in small groups, classes. And we all know somebody who's like this, right? People who are very strong in this area make good product owners, salespeople, managers. And the gift of being strong in this area is that you're likely to have good group awareness, right? You can read a room. You can easily build empathy and strong interpersonal relationships, which help build trust on that team. This is like the stereotypical good team player. But you also have to strike that balance and be able to work by yourself too. Because if you're too strong in this area, you might come off as clingy and somebody who can't work by themselves. So if you wanted to work on developing this style, you could work on teaching others or explaining concepts to other people, or even just practice working through issues in conversation. So we're going to start around on the outside here. These are styles that are used along with those, either social or solitary. So people with a strong logical or mathematical style use logic, reasoning, systems. These are people who think conceptually and abstractly, like patterns and connections, classifying or grouping information to learn it. May work well with numbers, lists, agendas, itineraries. These are people who often support their points with examples or statistics or pick up on logical flaws in people's arguments. So it's really easy to think of a math or a DevOps whiz, but I do want to say this isn't necessarily numbers, right? Like like a graphic designer would also fit into this category. Your graphic design is highly logical, structured, and organized, but it doesn't rely on that talent for numbers. So if you wanted to work on developing the style in yourself, you can spend time doing brain teasers, Sudoku, card games or board games that are really pattern-driven, like Azul, if you're familiar with that one, Gin Rummy, or chess. And the reason I say chess is because that's something that you can play online. You don't necessarily need another player for that. It can also help to think about the reasons behind what you're learning instead of just rote learning it, like learning for the test. You can also create outlines and lists of key points while you're studying or learning new information. So going down the list here, there's the verbal or linguistic learning style. So this is using words. It's either in speech or in writing, it doesn't really matter. It's people who are sensitive to the meanings of words, just flat out. So people who have a strong preference for this style find it easy to communicate with those words, written, spoken, email, phone call. They like reading and writing, learning new words, wordplay, picking up on new phrases and vocabulary. And the gift of being strong in this area is just being fluent and articulate, but the challenge can be to get to the point, cut out extraneous information, and to stop talking. So again, everybody knows somebody like this. So one of my grandfathers is like this. He gets his information from the radio, from newspapers, books, magazines, from the phone. He's always on the phone, stopping by at somebody's house to say hello. He's got the radio or the talk radio on, or the TV. So if you wanted to work on developing this style yourself, read more, listen to podcasts more, anything with words in it. And I want to contrast this with the oral or auditory music style of learning. So we just talked about words. This is more about sounds or music. That's maybe a little bit less prevalent in computer engineering, but it's about producing and appreciating rhythm, pitch, and those different qualities of sound. This is, again, just people who use rhythm and music in their learning. Maybe they have a lot of music running through their head, or can identify people by their voice over the phone or different musical instruments just based on sound. And it's for people who are like this. I have a friend who's a musician, and he can tell you not only which instruments are in a different track, which I find impressive because I am not a musician, but he told me a story where he was listening to a jazz record once with his stepfather, who's not a musician, and there were two musicians who were both playing the saxophone. I don't remember who they were, but my friend knew which musician was playing which instrument just by the way that they were playing the saxophone. And I find that to be really impressive. That is a really strong auditory musical learning style. So if you wanted to work on developing this in yourself, practice identifying people just by their voice on group calls. If you can do it discreetly by closing your eyes, by repeating important information to yourself on a beat, and obviously that gets back a little bit into words, or even just creating rhymes or using mnemonic devices to get into new information. There's also the physical or kinesthetic learning style. And this is learning by doing. This is using body language to communicate, to convey expression. People who have trouble sitting through long lectures without moving around, people who think while moving, who jump in and take the engine apart and then put it back together without reading the directions just to see how it works. These people are putting their learning into practice. And of course, I do want you to keep in mind, so writing things down is a physical activity, and drawing diagrams is a physical activity. You're touching and using physical objects as much as possible to help you intake and process and remember information. So this is somebody who might mull over problems while cooking or driving or eating. And when I was in college, I took a robotics class. It was microcontroller based. And my friend and I took this class together and we made a really good team. I did all the programming, and he would disappear into the wood shop, and he'd come back with whatever physical objects we needed. I didn't know how to make that. He didn't know how to program. We made some great robots. So if you wanted to develop this style, you should put a new skill into practice. Try it out. Don't just read about how to do it. Don't just watch the video. Go fix the sink. You could also practice role-playing before an important meeting or presentation. It's actually physically moving around and acting it out. And I think people are generally pretty familiar with visual or spatial learning. This is people who are thinking and using pictures, images, who are really good at visualizing abstractly and accurately. People who can easily visualize outcomes, plans, or objects. It's like your high school art teacher or an architect. And in the office, this can look like screenshots, whiteboards, screen shares. And before GPS became common, this is somebody who actually looked at the map instead of the list of directions. So if you wanted to practice using this style, use different colors, fonts, or symbols to code your notes. Study systems diagrams to see how pieces of the system fit into the whole. Or picture a procedure as a screenplay or a story, like a user story or a case study. And I do want to look at how these different styles map to different areas of the brain. This is a ton of information I'm going to throw you at this slide. I just want you to get the general idea, which is that there's a lot of overlap in how we use our brain. So through brain imaging, researchers have mapped different activities to what areas of the brain that they activate. Again, I'm not a neuroscientist. This is a general overview of the different functions. So the first one is that we have the parietal lobe. This is really activated by solitary and logical activities. It is specifically the left side of the parietal lobe that drives our logical thinking. We also have the occipital lobe, and this is the visual lobe, really. This manages the visual sense, and both of the two that I've highlighted already manage spatial orientation. And here's the cerebellum. So both the cerebellum and the motor cortex are important for physical activity. The cerebellum coordinates and regulates muscular activity, and the motor cortex is what plans, controls, and executes voluntary movements. We've also got the temporal lobe, and this is more for the auditory musical, because it's the right temporal lobe that is particularly important for understanding music. And we also have the frontal lobe. So solitary, social, and verbal styles all use the frontal lobe. It's a pretty important one. There is a lot of overlap in this brain, and that is why using all these different things is important. I also want to point out the sensory cortex, and this is just because all external information starts to enter our brain through sensation, literally all of it. And again, so if you don't use it, you lose it. That's how the brain withers. If you practice it, you're literally increasing your brain's capacity for that activity. So it should be obvious that there's a lot of overlap between those categories, if for no other reason than because I just pointed it out. So writing something down is physical as well as kinesthetic and verbal. Creating a rhyme is verbal and musical, and it's also physical if you're going to speak it out loud. But each of those activities is weighted towards one of those styles. And our preferences are also different in different situations. So I'm a lot more social when playing board games. Those are really logical and strategic than when I'm doing exercise or other physical activities. So for me, those are pretty solitary activities. But again, preferences get our attention. So what gets my attention when I'm playing a board game? People pointing out strategies or rules or interacting with other players. And what gets my attention when I'm exercising? Injuring myself, bodily sensations. But obviously, injuring myself, getting that physical feedback like that, that's not the best way to get feedback about whether or not I have proper exercise technique. It's just clearly not optimal. It's not the most efficient way to do it. Just because I don't want to talk to people I'm exercising or have an instructor move my limbs around doesn't mean it wouldn't be more efficient to learn that way. And that kind of brings us into our next model. So cognition is more about thinking and acquiring knowledge and less about preferences. It's about how your brain actually functions. Process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. So the Felder-Silverman model originated as a study of learning and teaching styles in college-level engineering students. And it does provide concrete instructional suggestions for maximizing information presentations in that higher education setting. So that makes it useful to us when we think about Agile. It's also informative to help us think about the styles in which we do teach and learn. And when I say teaching here, I'm not sure if I said this earlier, but I mean taking what we've learned and sharing it with somebody else. I don't mean it in a particularly formal context. I just mean transferring information from one individual to another individual or a group. I mean communicating something that you know to somebody else. And I also think it's important, they point this out pretty specifically, but all of these dimensions are essential to the engineering process. None of them is better than another one. You need all of them to successfully make something function. And they also say that including all of them comes close to providing an optimal learning environment for everybody. If you hit both poles, you're going to find all the students. So the first polarity deals with perception of content. It is the sensory intuitive dimension of the model. And fun fact, this dimension is based off of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is based off of Jung's archetype theories. So, it's not perfect. It's based on self-reported preferences, but life is not perfect. So the sensory side over here, that refers to learners who respond well to concrete external information, right? Facts, data, experimentation, linear, step-by-step instruction, sights, sounds, physical information. Whereas intuitive refers to learners who respond well to abstract, internal information, abstract concepts, principles, theories, possibilities, insights, and hunches. So sensors like solving problems by standard methods. They don't really like surprises, they're patient with detail, and intuitors like innovation. They're bored by detail, and they don't like repetition. The intuitors are more comfortable with symbols, which include words, than sensors are. So it's kind of the difference between facts and concepts, slow versus careless. excuse me. And everybody uses both tendencies, but most people respond better to one over the other, and this does vary by situation. So a classic TV example, I don't know if anybody in here is a fan of the X-Files, but I think everybody's at least heard of it. You know, Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, they're FBI agents. And Scully takes a slow, pragmatic, and scientific approach to all of their cases. And Mulder was trained as a behavior analyst, and he uses his hunches to drive his investigations. But even though they're fictional characters, they aren't two-dimensional in terms of their learning styles. There's an episode where Scully goes missing, and Mulder gets incredibly pragmatic to map out her possible locations. They've got like this ransom call, and there's a jet engine noise in the back of it, and he takes into account the time of the call, finds the airports in the area, and maps out the radii from where they could have originated. So focusing on concepts and using a lot of readings or other words uses abstract teaching content, and that favors intuitive learners. That's usually what we see in educational settings. But if you provide a balance of facts, data, and experiment results, that can help reduce this gulf. That can help reach all of your engineers. If you are curious about developing each side, for that sensory concrete side, I would suggest just practicing math problems if you need to brush up on doing so. Something like Khan Academy can be useful because that does bring you through that more abstract concept before those step-by-step instructions. But in the end, you've still got to go through and work out the steps by steps. For the more intuitive style, say watch a book, read a movie, and think about the themes in the story before you go read a review. And then compare. Go to a museum, read about the context behind a piece of art, and then come up with your interpretation based on your own experience or knowledge. It doesn't have to be deep, just connected to something else. This looks like a starfish to me. This artist uses a lot of red in their paintings. I wonder if it would be different if it was a different color. So the next dimension is input. We just talked about perception. This is input. And the two polarities that they have here are visual and verbal. And I think it's interesting to note that initially they had this as visual auditory. But eventually cognitive science research has shown that our brains generally convert written words into spoken words and process them the same way. So written words are not just purely visual, that's still verbal. So I mentioned a lot of examples of visual learners already, people for whom a picture is worth 8,000 words, several hours of frustration. So whiteboarding and drawing are a great way to explain, for example, software architecture, geometry, photographs. A visual learner is somebody who would probably have trouble following along and remaining interested in a lecture that was presented without visual aids. So note-taking can help with this. And a visual learner would also probably have a hard time following a long string of verbal directions unless they were written down or demonstrated. So in a group setting, you'd want to have presentations with both auditory and visual elements to be effective in reaching both polarities of learners. And just to drive the point home, if you did want to develop these styles, for visual, you'd picture new information as a scene in your head. For verbal, practice explaining something in a conversation, in writing, in an email. So we get to processing information. And the Felder-Silverman model has two poles for doing this: internal reflection and active external experimentation. So the reflective side, this is processing through introspection. These are people who work alone or in pairs. They're theoreticians. They're good at defining the problem and proposing solutions. And it's really a largely internal thing. Whereas active experimentation, this is doing something in the external world with the information. Through physical engagement or discussion, questioning, arguing, brainstorming. These are people who work well in groups. They're experimentalists. They're evaluating ideas through designing or performing experiments to find the ideas that actually work. These are people who are organizers and decision makers, because that's all largely external experimentation. And again, this is processing information. This is not selecting the information intake. That's the perception, the sensory intuitive dimension is selecting the information that you're intaking. And again, it's easy to think of people like this that you know, because this active reflective polarity is really closely related to extrovert-introvert polarity of the Myers-Briggs personality model. Of course, it's important to note that's personality, and we're talking about learning. So introvert, extrovert, and reflective active is a good comparison. It's a good inspiration. I'm not claiming that they're one-to-one equivalent. But reflective learners do more internal processing, more introverted work, and active learners do more external processing, more extroverted work. And Feldner and Silverman did suggest that always gearing teaching towards that active, extroverted pole does encompass the reflective pole, because you need to reflect in order to brainstorm and work with other people. So that's a great example where your preference might not be what is best for you. So to develop that active style of processing, try teaching, presenting, or demonstrating a concept to others, as I said before. And again, to develop that reflective style, brainstorm links between different concepts, and again, meditation practice will help you gain control over your thoughts, help you gain control over that internal processing. So the fourth dimension is comprehension. We have the sequential analysis and that global system side. So sequential learners are people who master the material in a logically ordered progression. They can work with a superficial or a partial understanding of the material, and most formal education material is presented in this way. Global learners do not master material sequentially, so they're often a little out of step with everybody else. They're either behind or ahead. They learn kind of in like fits and starts. All of a sudden, the puzzle pieces click together. So these are people who might be lost for a while, and suddenly, just get it, the light bulb goes off. These are the people who are asking, okay, well, but what if? So the sequential learners are following linear reasoning processes. Global learners are making intuitive leaps, might have difficulty coming up with concrete examples of how they arrived at an answer. The sequential learners are relatively better at analysis, and the global learners are relatively better at synthesis. So global learners can sometimes do better by jumping directly to more complex material and concepts, but the sequential learners tend to do better with a steady progression of complexity. Right? So sequential learners are seeing the trees, and the global learners are seeing the forests. The sequential learners are analysis thinkers, and the global learners are systems thinkers. I think it's clear how engineering will benefit from both. So to give kind of examples of this, you guys remember the peanut butter and jelly computer science exercise, right? You have to give step-by-step instructions to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Somebody's pretending that they are a computer. So for some reason, somebody was trying to explain to a sequential learner how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You give that person step-by-step instructions. Okay, pick up the jelly jar in one hand, use your other hand to twist the lid counterclockwise until it comes off, put the lid down, that'd be fine. They'd be able to fill in any gaps in the sequence. Oh, I definitely need to take the lid off before I put the knife in the peanut butter. And they'd be able to go and produce this technically precise peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So I'm more of a global learner. If you started sequencing like that with me, I wouldn't know what you were talking about. I wouldn't be able to fill in those gaps in the instructions until I knew what a peanut butter and jelly sandwich was. Okay, it's 2 flat pieces of bread with peanut butter and jelly in the middle. All right, that makes sense. So then you can say stuff, all right, I need a knife to spread the filling on each side. I'm gonna need to twist the jar lids counterclockwise to get them open. Then I can start to build the sandwich, and I'll figure it out as I go. So, and incidentally, that's active processing. That's not reflective processing. I'm putting that information out to the real world building the sandwich. Even though I prefer that reflective processing. And for global learners, so if you don't specify that you want grape jelly, you might get strawberry. So, okay, what if I use jam? Is that still a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? So to cover both types of people, you can present the goal or the big picture before presenting the steps, because that's exposing students to advanced concepts before they be sequentially introduced. You need to establish context and relevance related to people's experiences, come up with applications and what-ifs of the material and allow for that, allow for people to come up with their own ways of solving the problem, and encouraging interdisciplinary approaches to exercises and problems. Right, so that's kind of even breaking down the silos between testing, DevOps, development. So if you wanted to develop your sequential learning, practice breaking a procedure down into different sets of sequential questions. For global, ask people to apply knowledge to a different problem in a different discipline, right? Like using chemistry and cooking, geometry and sewing. These are ways that you can encompass those polarities. And this is not really where I wanted to focus my time, but I do think it's important to address because it's important and popular research on the topic of learning styles. If I don't bring it up, when you go out there, somebody else is going to bring it up. So colloquially, this is the paper that debunked learning styles. And I just want to say, so research papers necessarily have a very narrow focus, and they're also necessarily imperfect. So this one focused on looking for evidence matching a preferred learning style to increase scores in I think it was middle school or high school, whatever kind of assessment they were using in their experiment. They didn't state what kind of assessment it was. I imagine it was multiple choice. I don't know. It did seem like that was an important data point that I would have wanted to know in this context. And what they found in their experiments was that there was not statistically significant evidence that teaching students using their preferred learning styles leads to a better outcome for that group of students than the other group of students when they're all evaluated using the same unspecified methods. They did find that using one teaching method over another based on content led to better outcomes for all students, regardless of preferences. They did recommend more practical research to prove out the best types of teaching modalities for different subjects. They saw that as very empirical evidence that could be generated. And they also continually mention that even though they're not seeing hard evidence for matching those learning styles, like taking okay, I prefer visual learning, so when things are presented to me visually, I'm gonna learn it better for the test. That's matching those learning styles. They're saying that doesn't mean that they don't exist like that, just that in 2008, they were not able to prove that out. They also acknowledge that varying instruction based on the student can lead to amazing outcomes. They say that in this paper. What they are doing is taking issue with commercial learning style assessment quizzes that immutably categorize people based on self-reported preferences and recommend teaching to those outcomes. That's what that paper is about. They do mention that prior knowledge and educational experience, as well as personality, have an effect on how well somebody learns something. So I don't know how much of a shocker this paper was for the community at the time, but it's not something that's in conflict with the content that I have here today. We do know now that the brain has the ability to continuously change throughout someone's life. It's that neuroplasticity concept. We also know that there's no one-size-fits-all answer to education, and that practical considerations prevent us from taking a one-size-fits-all approach. Also, we're talking about learning in the workplace. That is a lot different than learning in a public classroom setting or even in a higher education setting. Learning in the workplace is focused on production outcome, group work. It's not focused on passing standardized tests. Learning in the workplace also allows for a different combination of one-on-one tutoring, social learning, and individual learning than a classroom with a teacher and 25 plus students. So while I think it's an important paper, and I think it's important to understand what it says, it's publicly available, it's not behind any academic research walls. You can email me and I will send it to you if you cannot find it. I think it's important to understand what it says, what it doesn't say. I think it does not end the discussion of learning styles. It didn't debunk anything except those for-profit quizzes. It had its focus, science has continued. All right, so let's connect Agile and learning. So remember, learning style is a group of behaviors centered around absorbing, processing, and retaining information. So they're grouping common ways of learning, they're not fixed, and one is not better than the other. We use different strategies in different scenarios, we adapt, and we learn how to learn. So for example, we all have the capacity to think intuitively and to think analytically. So it's the processing part of learning, that sensory intuitive dimension, intuitive thinking, that quick, automatic, based on rule of thumb. And the analytical sensory thinking is logical and reflective. So it is useful to think intuitively in a crisis situation, and it is useful to think analytically when planning your budget. That same concept applies in taking information. When we engage with the same information in multiple ways, it helps build better understandings and more robust schemas, so we're able to draw on different aspects of our memory for that information because we're drawing on more parts of the brain. So again, Agile is it's that creative process being applied to something that's traditionally scientific, which is software development. So it's adaptive, iterative, collaborative, and productive. You have the creative process, you have an idea, you sketch it out, outline it, create a draft, get feedback, and iterate. You release something, you get a critique of it, you take it and you improve over time. You know it's never going to be perfect, even as a masterpiece, right? The Mona Lisa does not have eyebrows, and I'm wearing Mona Lisa socks right now. So any creative professional, including developers, will tell you that you learn on the job. You're learning by doing. And Agile is facilitating that learning and directing it into a structured process that provides end value to users, which is working software. And Agile development is also teamwork. You need to use a certain amount of social learning to facilitate that teamwork. And teamwork is a learned skill. It's unrealistic to cater to everyone's preferred style of learning because you need to take responsibility for figuring out how you learn best and how you can best contribute to the team. Of course, part of that is teaching or sharing out what you've learned or accomplished. So constantly learning about other people and their learning processes, being mindful of the ways or biases in which you're presenting information are going to help with that. And improving communication is removing barriers to learning that information, which is ultimately improving value to that customer. Because those self-organizing teams, part of the reason that they are better than non-self-organizing teams is because they have that intergroup knowledge. They know how to work together. So we're going to stick with the Scrum ceremonies here when I'm mapping these processes because they only gave me 1 hour to talk. But the Scrum ceremonies do lend themselves to certain styles of information transfer. As I mentioned, communication is affected by the audience, but it's also affected by its format. So I have a photo, I'm not going to read it to you pixel by pixel because that's not meaningful unless you're a computer. I'm going to show you the picture or send you a file of the picture. So again, there's that certain amount of tailoring the medium tailoring the presentation medium to the information and not just understanding ways in which people are receiving that information. Because sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words. And that is why learning about learning strengthens communication because it helps us think about the methods and strategies that we're using to transmit information in a way that it can be easily understood. And it can also help us to better ask questions when we don't understand what we're being taught. So I am going to focus on those areas, but ultimately you need to do whatever works for your team as long as you are delivering value to the users. The thing about letting people use their preferences is that it helps people stay engaged. So if your team is really struggling with a mostly verbal stand-up, try something else. Make it visual. Work towards improving through iterations. So just kind of going through the ceremonies here, I started with planning or the sprint kickoff. So this is a really high-level creative process. This is the beginning of a new sprint. This is where business is communicating the latest and the development is asking the business team questions and estimating stories, and you kind of got everybody in the same room. So there are a couple things that I would consider good practices, like sharing somebody's screen through the meeting, especially if you're working with a task management system like Jira. That's an easy way to communicate both visually and verbally during this planning meeting. And note-taking is a great way for everybody to stay engaged, and it is particularly helpful to engage that more physical aspect. And it is also a great way for more active learners to improve long-term retention. This is also because you have everybody in the same room. This is where you tend to have people with different styles trying to communicate with each other. So, for example, this is an example that's based off of a real experience that I had. I had a product owner who was more global, intuitive, social, visual, and a developer on my team who was more sequential, sensory, solitary, but still visual. And the next priority was that our product owner wanted to add an ability to sell a physical, shippable good, to an e-commerce store that currently only sold digital items. Our product owner thought this was going to be really easy to implement. Just add a couple fields to the database, add a couple fields to the form. The developer says it's going to be a lot more complicated than that, right? Like you're going to have to update more databases than you're thinking. We're going to have to think through that. What about the shipping information? What if something goes wrong? Where is we storing that data? We got to think about this. We could calculate shipping costs. What if somebody doesn't ship an order? So what I would now recommend, instead of the way that the conversation went, is let's have the developer whiteboard out these new flows, right? Let's whiteboard out what we're talking about here on the front end and on the back end. So not only is that going to help the product owner, that's going to help the whole team understand what's necessary to complete that feature epic. I also recommend just breaking down that global concept, shippable goods, into a sequence, a user story, having people around the table say, this is the scenario, right? That's sharing what's in the developer's head in a way that our product owner could understand more easily. In a different scenario, this can also help the product owner share what they're visualizing, right? Screen sharing examples on the internet. So once we've worked through that a little bit, we can turn that high-level list of associated tasks into stories. That's holding a place for that sequence of tasks necessary to roll out a robust feature, and that also gives the product owner and the rest of the team an overview of the work that's necessary to get that epic completed. And that is both visual and verbal. So, and again, that was a scenario that actually happens. I do think that in a different scenario, whiteboarding would probably still be appropriate if there is that disconnect between two different roles in the team. But depending on the people involved, it might work to just explain complexities out loud. It depends on the people involved and the amount of time you have. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And there isn't the opportunity to do it perfectly every time. There is the opportunity to note it and come back. We also have the daily Scrum meeting, and this is something that I do see teams struggle with a lot, trying to get perfect every time. So this isn't supposed to be a time to give status. It's supposed to be a daily time to have a short conversation about what you did yesterday, what you'll do today, and any blockers. Usually it does turn into a time to share status, particularly if your organization is newer to Agile and needs more structure to that ceremony. So if you are in that place to help communicate information, you can make your speech varied and a little bit more dramatic instead of sounding like you're reading off a cue card, because that's going to make your words easier to intake and remember. So that ceremony itself is geared towards verbal communication. It could be visual if you're looking at a product board every day. The keynote, she suggested having people stand on balancing boards to keep it short, so you can pass around a physical speaking object, because that can help retain engagement. People who prefer that active learning, and it also highlights the flow of conversation. So that can make it easier to point out where we're losing the focus of the conversation. These two people keep talking back and forth. We haven't made it around. This is also a great time to touch base with more solitary team members or find out what they've been up to if you haven't talked to them in a few hours. But what's interesting, especially to me, about the Daily Scrum is that this is a ceremony where it's really easy to lose whoever has a less dominant communication style. So if everyone's really conversational except one person, you might lose their interest. If everyone's really sequential except a couple people, you're going to lose the people who aren't sequential. So in my opinion, this is the Agile ceremony that benefits the most from adjusting to your specific situation. And I just went to sort of daily project work. So you do have to let the team find a balance that allows them to produce their best work. Some people thrive being co-located, some people work better from home or work best at a certain time of day, do best bouncing questions off of other people, do best independently researching their own answers. But you do need to make sure that your best working style isn't to the detriment of others. So if you work best from the hours of midnight to 8 a.m., but your whole team is in your time zone, that's not going to work that well. It's also obviously not a good idea to use your preferences as an excuse. You still are responsible for maintaining your role in the team. So the Scrum Master can help make sure that this is working for everyone. They're helping hold people accountable to the team ceremonies, and they're also helping to adjust those ceremonies. They're open to the flexibility and change necessary to produce that best teamwork. And at the end of every sprint cycle, we have the sprint review, or the user acceptance testing. And of course, ideally, we're shifting this left the whole time, and the stakeholders, including the product owner, are communicating with the Scrum team the entire sprint. And if you're co-located, that can be pretty easy. You're a developer, you're a tester, you find the product owner, and see if the new feature is really what they wanted. How do you like it? So being face-to-face can make it easier to read body language and to get a better read on the actual user experience instead of just reported back. If you are not in the same location, you can hop on a quick Google Hangout or some other technology that enables screen share. So either the developer demonstrating or the product owner testing it out. And that can drastically reduce your feedback communication cycle. Instead of waiting for the last day of the sprint or even the next daily Scrum, you can have a product owner actually see and test a new feature. You can put it in front of them that much earlier. And that builds trust around the team, that shortens that communication feedback cycle, and supports a greater level of autonomy making decisions. So doing that during the sprint and shifting it left instead of waiting till the end, it's going to come especially naturally to proactive, active, physical, social communicators who like to bounce their ideas off of others and see that work put into practice. That is something that you want to encourage. And of course, for testing bugs, that you would also want to include sequential steps of how a bug was discovered. And you can do that through telling it like a story. First I did this, then I did this, and then I did this. So I do want to leave some time for questions here. Again, thank you for coming to my presentation. This emoji is so that you know how excited I was, even when you're looking at these slides later.